Hello, everyone. This is Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast. And today I am very glad to be joined by Michael Boldin. He's the founder and head of the 10th Amendment Center. Follow him on Twitter at Michael Boldin. He's also the host of the Path to Liberty podcast. Michael, thanks so much for joining me.
Pretty awesome. How's it going, man?
It's going real good, So the first question that I have is, what did the founding fathers tell us about what to do when the federal government violates the Constitution?
Oh, man. I could spend like 2 hours on that. But the short version is, I guess the best place to go to start on that is probably going to be Thomas Jefferson's fair copy is what we call it. This is like an early draft, October-ish of 1798 of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, which a lot of people think is like the beginning of nullification, although it wasn't. He was basically reiterating principles that were widely understood, resistance all through the years leading up to the Revolution, the war for secession against the British Empire. So he was reiterating very widely understood positions that when government does stuff that abuses the powers that have been delegated to it, they do stuff that they are authorized to do, but you hate the policy. The solution, according to Jefferson, is to vote the bums out. The way he put it in that draft of the Kentucky Resolutions was a change of the members of the government is the constitutional remedy. But where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, again, Jefferson's words, not mine, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Therefore, anytime they do stuff they're not authorized to do, so like 99.995% of the time, the response should not be going to the federal government in the hopes that the federal government is going to limit its own power, be that through voting bums out in the hopes that new bums are going to be cool, or going to federal courts in the hopes that federal courts will limit federal powers. Tom Woods often gives the analogy of this one over the years that when you do that, you're basically in a divorce proceeding and you're going to your mother-in-law to adjudicate the process. It's not a fair ball game. And people like Jefferson, Madison, and many others recognize that same thing, that all of those branches of the federal government could be corrupt and violating your rights at the same time. So you need something outside of the federal government to limit the federal government, and that is the people of the several states. So it's a resistance.
And I recall a video that you made. I watched it my first or second year in law school about Madison's contributions too. And Madison also talks about this in the Federalist Papers, doesn't he?
Yeah. So Federalist 46, he talks about a strategy. There was some concern that the new central government or the new federal government was going to swallow up the rights of the people or the people of the several states. And he's like, nah, we've looked at this. We know this is kind of straightforward stuff. The federal government relies on the resources of the people in the states to be able to implement what they want to do. So in Federalist 46, early 1788, he basically said you've got 4 ways to defeat federal programs, whether they are warrantable, that is constitutional but bad policy, or unwarrantable, outside the Constitution. One of those 4 things was a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, James Iredell, who was one of the first Supreme Court justices, I think he was like 3rd. He was appointed by George Washington. His description, when the government would usurp or exercise powers that were not delegated to it, steal powers, the people would need to resist them. So you always have to have a resistance, a refusal to cooperate, a non-participation. And in that Federalist 46, Madison specifically said, if it would be a bunch of states in unison, this would create an environment that the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. Again, Madison's words, and this was at a time when that government was going to be tiny and like just unmanageable how small it is in comparison to the largest government in the history of the world. Mind you, it spends about 7 to 8 times the amount today as the Chinese communist government. So supposedly, if you're stopping socialism, the number one place to look is to reduce the size, the scope, and impact of the central government in Washington, D.C. So Madison, Federalist 46, but that's actually been surprisingly, if I can just ramble on this, if you're cool with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, because I'll just keep talking. You just got to tell me to shut the hell up at some point. So, it's not just some arcane philosophical argument that we're talking about when we're talking about James Madison's advice. We don't actually need to rely on the Supreme Court to exercise our rights. We don't we don't need permission. But when we get sanction from a large, like a well-known organization like the Supreme Court, it sure makes it less difficult. So the Supreme Court has actually sanctioned this strategy by James Madison in something called the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. And there's 5 major cases that go all the way back to 1842. This is Prigg versus Pennsylvania. And then the most recent one is 2018, Murphy versus NCAA. So you've got 5 major cases over 150 plus years called the Anti-Commandeering Doctrine. And this is where the Supreme Court has validated or held that even no matter what the federal government does, we can actually set aside the constitutionality of everything that they do. Let's say everything they do is constitutional. They can't, under the Constitution and under modern Supreme Court precedent, force the states to use personnel or resources to implement or effectuate any federal regulatory programs. And we know from the government itself, for example, the National Governors Association during one of these so-called fake shutdowns over the years, they're never a real shutdown, right? But I think it was like the 2013 shutdown. I'll put that in quotes. The National Governors Association was really concerned about this, and in their press release that they put out, they said specifically, states are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. And the dirty little secret they don't want us to know is that partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. So as long as states and individuals opt out and refuse to participate in the enforcement of these federal programs, we can bring them to an end. And we see this happen with 36 states basically taking small steps on this in regards to a plant, cannabis, that all levels of the federal government say shouldn't be authorized by anyone, anywhere, at any time.
That most recent case, is that the federal sports gambling case, or am I misremembering?
Yeah, New Jersey, Murphy versus NCAA. And Samuel Alito, who I'm no fan of, I'm not a fan of any of these people, really, but he basically took the position and he wrote for the majority. He said, the federal government can't tell the state governments, state legislatures, what they can or cannot do, even if they conflict with federal law. And in Alito's words, a more direct affront to state sovereignty is not easy to imagine. So even in that situation, they're basically taking the position as late as 2018. Again, it's not arcane legal arguments we're talking about here. As late as 2018, they basically have held in a 7-2 decision or opinion that it doesn't even matter if they're violating federal law. The feds can't tell them to start or stop doing anything. We just need to ramp this up on anything and everything, and not just weed and immigration sanctuary cities. We can apply this to just about everything under the sun, whether it's environmental regulations, healthcare. It could be things like federal gun control. There's tons of that on the books going all the way back to 1934 and on and on. I mean, everything under the sun, really.
Well, that's a great segue. Is why should people across the entire political spectrum care about the 10th Amendment?
Well, they all don't.
Why should they?
Well, they should, because, so there's 2 sides of that coin. And I recognize that most people tend to be very partisan. They suck when it comes to principles. So for example, on immigration sanctuary cities, you'll hear a lot of people who support localities, whether it's cities, counties, or states, saying we're not going to help enforce federal immigration law, tell you that you're a racist if you want to do the exact same thing with federal gun control, and vice versa. For example, when the Trump administration was in, we had attacks on these types of efforts come from people like John Bolton, Jeff Sessions, Dick Morris. They all said nullification is like an evil, terrible thing because you get immigration sanctuary cities. But are they going to be saying the same thing in the next 4 years when we see places like maybe Missouri and Arizona, South Carolina, and elsewhere? We're already seeing legislation being pushed forward that would opt out of enforcement of federal gun control. I think they'll probably be quiet on those things because, unfortunately, they're very partisan. But while I hate the partisanship, I think it's awful. I think those people are disgusting. They're gross. But we can leverage that. As long as we can leverage that, if they're willing to do the right thing now, even if it's for a bad reason, let's get that moving forward and push them to do it as much as possible, because the more that we can weaken the power of the central government, as Hoppe put it in this great 1997 speech for the Mises Institute that was in Newport Beach, Southern California, he basically said, stop helping in the enforcement of each and every federal law. Without local compliance by local authorities, the will of the central government is not much more than hot air. He was basically taking the same position, whether I'm assuming he's not a Madison kind of guy, but he was taking that same position strategically, recognizing that a central power without local support can't do very much very effectively.
So most of my listeners are very radical, voluntarist, anarchist types.
Ooh.
I personally, I'm a big Hoppe fan and Mises and Rothbard and everything like that. A lot of them, though, will scoff at the notion of using the Constitution in any way because they take the Spoonerite position. Well, what do you say to them?
If they scoff at it, okay. Use a different strategy. That's fine. I mean, we could talk about agorism. I mean, agorism is a form of nullification. If you don't want to mention the Constitution, that's fine. I mean, we could talk about Spooner too. And most people who actually cite Spooner haven't read much of his work. I love his writings on trial by jury, on the unconstitutionality of federal slavery laws like the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, 1793, things like that. He did a lot of stuff on this. And people who cite Spooner basically like to cite the one phrase that he said, which was, the Constitution has either authorized what we have today or has been powerless to prevent it. But as much as I like Spooner myself, Spooner made a big error there because words on paper can't start or stop doing anything. Words on paper can't enforce themselves. And if we ignore what the founders themselves said about those words on paper, James Madison in Federalist 48 specifically referred to the Constitution as a mere parchment barrier. Like, you can have the best rules for a business, for an organization, for a community, whatever it may be, but without an enforcement mechanism, then you can't actually, those words mean nothing. So it really is human action that we're talking about here. So whether you love the Constitution, you hate it, you think it's a slave document, whatever it may be, it's a tool that we can use that a lot of people in the marketplace, the overall general public, really want to believe that the government people are supposed to follow. So we can use that, we can ignore it, we can do agorists, we can do 3D printing, all of that, as long as we're finding ways to exercise our rights without getting permission from the central government in Washington, D.C., we are advancing liberty on pretty much the same path. At least for now, that's pretty awesome.
Awesome. So do you want to tell me a little bit more about what the 10th Amendment Center has been doing in the last, say, 6 months to a year?
Oh, man. Another 3-hour conversation. Well, we've been doing this since 2006. I founded the organization back in 2006 when I set up the website and I started blogging maybe a few months later. My goal really was just to this was during the Bush administration. I was an anti-war activist, so I just was sick and tired of the war, the surveillance, the drug war, the Real ID Act, the Patriot Act, all that stuff. And I wanted to actually just reach out to people who are claiming to be so-called constitutionalists, and I still do the same thing today, and point out how they're just fakes and frauds. And really, there's everything that they do is either a lie or it costs way more than they promised us. So it's a lie anyways. So we can't trust them. And if we really want to advance individual liberty, we have to make our decisions on the most difficult, divisive, and important situations closer to the individual. Of course, we want the end result in the long term to be about the individual making their own choice. But again, we're talking about the largest empire in history. The more that we move away from that, the better. And then we can create examples where people learn. And if we're talking about weed, for example, I think that's a great one, because years ago, I would have thought that if the Supreme Court held that you can't do something, that anyone who had a law saying you could would immediately repeal it. So we can go back to the 2005 Gonzalez versus Raich case. Angel Raich, who I think is a hero, should have some street names after her, but she had a tumorous cancer in her skull. It was like the size of a golf ball, basically. The doctor recommended that she used cannabis at the time under Proposition 215, passed by people in California in 96, to authorize limited medical use of marijuana to treat it or to help alleviate some of the symptoms. Well, what does the local sheriff's department and the DEA do? They show up at her home or her caregiver's home where they had 6 plants in the backyard, never bought or sold, never crossed state lines, only consumed on their own property. And they came in and they stomped them out, basically like, your supremacy clause tells us that we can do this. And so she took it to the Supreme Court and she lost. She lost. Gonzalez versus Raich basically said, doesn't matter if, you have some state law, federal law is supreme in all situations. And at the time of that case, there were 10 states that had various forms of medical marijuana laws on the books. Angel Rate said at first she was going to go away to Canada if she lost. And then she decided at some point the flip switch. She's like, no. It doesn't matter what they say. I'm going to continue doing what I'm going to continue do, which is right for me and for others, no matter what they happen to say. And that's why she's heroic. So again, 10 states at that time had these medical marijuana laws on the books. And I guess I would have thought at the time, like, well, they're all going to be repealed. But not one was repealed. And today we're talking about 36 states that now defy Washington, D.C. to some level or another on a plant that they say you cannot grow, consume, buy, sell, or even own. It doesn't matter. And 15 of them are now authorizing broader recreational legalization. So I think that is a really big strategy. That's something we focus on heavily here, but not just on weed. We look at that and we say, well, what other areas can we do that in? Where can we opt out of a federal program, or where can we legalize what the feds prohibit? And I think some of the main areas are like the police state, asset forfeiture, the drug war, surveillance, not using their surveillance technologies, not sharing data with the federal government, not being part of their information sharing environment or their fusion centers, opting out of those, asset forfeiture. Gun control, the right to keep and bear arms, for example, states like Missouri, Arizona, South Carolina, Texas, Alabama, like 8 or 9 total states right now are considering legislation to ban local enforcement, state enforcement of federal gun control measures. From 1934, the National Firearms Act, the Gun Control Act of 1986, the Undetectable Firearms Act of 1988, and on. And the bump stock ban of 2018, we can't forget that. But the more that you do that, and Judge Napolitano specifically talked about our legislation to nullify federal gun control in this manner a few years ago on Fox Business. He said, this will render them basically nearly impossible to enforce. He was recognizing, like James Madison did, like Rosa Parks at some point did, that HOPA recognized that without compliant assistance from locals, their programs are done. And I would rather have totally impossible to enforce than nearly impossible, but at least under the status quo, nearly impossible is a hell of a good step forward.
Yeah.
If you want to link to that, if I can do a quick spam, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. We do an annual State of the Nullification Movement report. This year's, we released it last summer. It's about 105 pages. The first half talks about the theory, the strategy, the history, all that stuff, the constitutionality, the law, the court cases, and all that. The second half talks about how it's being implemented right now. And then again, some of those issues that I mentioned, surveillance, gun control, asset forfeiture, drug war, etc. And that is a free download. You can get a Kindle version, Apple Books, or a PDF.
Yeah, wonderful. I'll put that in the show notes page as well.
Thank you.
One thing that Jeff Dice does is he always talks about how, especially in the last year, how things have gotten so politicized. And I was reading Theory of Socialism and Capitalism last night. Hoppe talks about how in communist Russia.
Just knock that out in a night.
I did about 100 pages. I had 3 or 4 out.
Awesome.
But so he was talking about how in Soviet Russia, how everything was politicized, because that's how it is. You, in a system, you still have to decide how resources are allocated, and someone is going to win out because there's going to be differences of opinion. Well, one thing that we've seen is that where literally everything has been politicized in the United States, especially in the last year. You can't go to the grocery store without politics. You can't go to work without politics entering in now. How, and we kind of touched on this, but how does nullification in the 10th Amendment help reduce that problem?
Well, we have to understand the source of it. And I want to just quick pull up this link. It's a URL that let me just find this from rightful despotism. Okay, so what we're talking about first has to be the cause of this. Why is everything politicized? Well, you may love him, you may hate him, but we can go back to George Washington in his famous farewell address of 1796. And if it's cool, I just want to read this one passage. I think will make my case. He said, "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. the disorders and miseries which gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual, and sooner or later the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of liberty. What he's basically saying here is that factionalism, partisanship is actually something that comes from consolidation or centralization of power. So as long as there's a centralization of power, and again, we're talking about Soviet Russia, which was a highly centralized state. The United States, so-called federal government, is the largest central government in the history of the planet. When everything is decided by a small group of people for everyone, doesn't matter their regional interests, their economic, their political, their personal preferences, their religious viewpoints, where it's all decided as a one-size-fits-all solution, everything will be a total fight to the death. Every small issue becomes politicized. And that's what we see today. And whether Washington was great or not, he certainly was at least pretty smart, if not prophetic, about that passage in his farewell address in 1796. So how does nullification help in this? We're looking to decentralize all the things. Basically, anything and everything that they do, we really want to bring it more towards the individual, decentralize, localize, and individualize all the decisions. And when you have it that way, that's what really fights against that partisanship and that politicization of everything. And I'm sure Deist has made that case in one way or another a few times in some of his speeches.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Yeah, that's kind of what brought me around, because I got aware of this circa 2015, 2016. And I just remember it was, I'd been grappling with these ideas, and then Jeff Deist came through, and I just, through Tom Wood's show, I listened to a lot of his stuff. But
that'll happen, right?
It'll happen. You get sucked down that wormhole. But
this is from a guy who's reading Hop on a casual Saturday night. So
well, when you have kids, you're home time and you don't get out too much. But yeah. So let's see how to frame this. So you've been doing this since 2006. You've seen, a lot of the rise of the American police state. Especially, it seems like everything's gone on steroids in the last year. Are you optimistic at the future, or are you pessimistic? Are you alarmed at what's happening? What's your thought about the next 4 years?
I'm a total cynic. I'm a total pessimist. But I have this kind of Rothbardian long-term vision. I forget where it came from, but I remember this great quote that I can paraphrase. He basically says, the biggest challenge for the libertarian in the present epoch is to cast off his needless and debilitating pessimism, set his sights on the long-term future, and set about its road to its attainment. I am not sure if that's left and right prospects for liberty or what, but basically this is... When you can see the barrel of the gun behind everything and anything, I think it's very easy to become very cynical and very pessimistic. But if we really believe that markets are more powerful than government, that liberty is the best solution to anything and everything, then certainly we can be realistic in recognizing that in the short term, things are pretty bad, and they're probably going to continue to be bad, if not worse and worse and worse. But we know that in the long run, that liberty will win out. It may not be in my lifetime or yours, and I don't actually expect it to be, and there's my cynicism. I really don't. So I have really no hopes of a libertarian state of society while I'm alive. But I believe that it's my duty, at least my role in life, my part of the marketplace is really to help set the foundation and provide people the tools that they can use to help advance that today and in the future.
Yeah, well said. I mean, and like I appreciate a lot of things about Ron Paul, but one of the best things I appreciate about him is that he's a happy warrior. And it seems like Rothbard was like that too.
He's much nicer than me, though. I mean, we're having fun here, but I'm a jerk when it comes down to these people piss me off. I mean, politicians make me disgusted. I'll host them at my own events, and then I'll be up at a podium and be like, well, politicians are gross, even when you hear, things that you like from them. And that's really the truth, because you can't trust anyone with power. And as far as strategy, too, if we're talking nullification specifically, the day after the Kentucky resolutions of 1798 passed, that was November 16th, 1798. On the 17th, he sends his buddy James Madison a letter, a copy of the Virginia Resolves, he called it. And he said, we need to distinctly affirm all the important principles they contain, but we should only push as far as events will render prudent. So Jefferson recognized that you can take small steps forward for liberty. He specifically said in another letter that the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. It takes time even for good people to recognize what's good for them, right? The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches, but we still have to have the ultimate principles. We don't want to water down our end goal by saying, well, we're taking a small step and that's all we need to do. No, you can take a small step and say, well, this is a small step towards what we want to achieve down here without ruining that message, but without trying to go so far that you never, ever get anything done.
And was it true with so this gets into the nerdy geeking outside of it, which we'll have to plan.
I can do that.
To plan another episode. I wrote my long paper requirement for law school about the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions.
Nice.
And it's true that at the time that Thomas Jefferson and Madison, did they not feel safe enough to publish those under their own names?
Right. They definitely did not. Well, Jefferson was the sitting vice president at the time, and basically the Alien Sedition Act, it punished free speech, but there was a carve out. You couldn't actually basically put anyone in the federal government into ill repute. So if you said that John Adams had a big fat arse, like a publisher did, you might actually get shut down or jailed. But there was a carve out for the vice president because he was the opposing party at the time. They didn't run as a ticket. And so Jefferson was kind of the sideshow. Yeah, you could say whatever you want about this guy, just not everybody else. So Jefferson, in secret, drafted this. He really wanted it introduced in North Carolina, I believe, at the time. But John Breckinridge in Kentucky decided to carry it there. And then James Madison secretly authored the Virginia resolutions at the time as well. And then they were introduced and passed in December of 1798.
It just seems
the
like
biggest secret, though, was Jefferson, though, and there was a lot of correspondence between those two. But during that time in 1798, it kind of dwindled. We know they actually had a private meeting at some point. Someone met up with somebody. Maybe Wilson Carey Nicholas met with Jefferson. Breckinridge met with Nicholas. Breckinridge met with Madison. And so there was some actual face-to-face meetings, but very little in correspondence except for some main things through 1798 and 1799.
So you're saying it was a conspiracy?
Oh yeah, well, it makes it juicier that way, right?
Right. Well, it just seems to me that these folks are so much more ballsy than people are these days, and maybe that's not true. But
well,
you were talking about
they fought in previous decades. The founding generation really fought a long, bloody war of secession. Now, Jefferson himself specifically said nullification was the moderate middle ground. This was middle ground between unlimited submission and a bloody, violent revolution. You don't need to have that. Even Ron Paul himself, back on the campaign trail when he was running for office, I think it was the 2012 campaign, he gave a speech in Arizona. He's basically like, we're really seeing what is a scenario where we're going to have plenty of de facto nullification. It may not be like local agents having a standoff, OK Corral style with some feds, with the ATF or the DEA, and that's not really good strategy anyways. We're not looking for a violent confrontation, but if opting out brings things down and you have the support of the founders like James Madison, James Iredell, and others, plus the Supreme Court, just use the strategy that's right in front of us that no one seems to be able to challenge legally. It's already working. No one complains about immigration sanctuary cities, 300 plus of these, because they don't like the flowery language they use. It's not hurting anyone's feelings. They complain about them because they're highly effective at rendering federal immigration laws very difficult to enforce. So we can look at those, read them. I've read about 200 or so of these things over the years and learn how they're implementing this and try to apply it to other stuff.
Wonderful. Well, we're running out of time here. Do you want to plug anything specifically? I can throw it in the show notes page.
I think 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, that free download that I was mentioning. You don't have to leave your email address, none of that stuff. Just download, read, share, learn the stuff, mock us, love us, whatever. I just want to get the info out there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Cool. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and hopefully we'll do it again.